Just to remind you guys, I'm Christian Ross, and I'm in the East Cobb office. If you haven't had the pleasure of closing with us, if you ever have a closing here up here in East Cobb, come on down, send me an email. My email, the best way to reach out to me, cross@cb.law. And everyone at Campbell Brandon has that shortened email as well. So it's just first initial, last name @cb.law. So you can reach out to me, Christian Ross, so cross@cb.law. Feel free to email me if you want a copy of these papers. Otherwise, you should have gotten it already from Terry, or we'll reach out afterwards and give you that as well. And then some of you have already kind of done it. So, feel free to use the chat feature because I kind of want this to be more interactive. I'm not interested in just kind of yelling at you the whole time. But we're going to keep this a little short, maybe 30, 40 minutes, something like that. And you'll get this handout after the fact, or you can reach out to me as well. So this class is about repairs and credits at closing from a seller to a buyer, and how to kind of go back and forth between that, how to not get stuck, make sure not to offer something that's not very realistic or practical for your seller and buyer. So let's kind of think about first, what are the options? What are we looking at as far as what is our toolbox? What do we have at our disposal to handle repairs, handle issues of that nature? So number one, lower the purchase price. Number two, increase the seller's credit to closing costs. Three, have the seller do the repairs prior to closing or after closing. And you could even have them paid for at closing to be done later, or done before, paid for later, something of that nature. But it's all about making sure we know what we're going to do by closing, that either it's done before closing or it's going to be done after, but we've at least collected the money for it. And there are pluses and minuses to each one of those scenarios, as you all very well know. There's probably a preference that you each have as to, which one you prefer to do and what your priorities are, and feel free to keep doing that. I'm just going to give you my perspective. And this is obviously the perspective of a closing attorney, and kind of how we make the closing experience the most easy to handle and the less stressful, the least stressful. So let's first talk about the issues. And I always tell people, if you haven't heard me say this before, this is my job. My job is to issue spot. And maybe you can take on that job as well. It's not to provide solutions always. It's not to prevent things from being a catastrophe. It's just to be able to look at something and say, here are the issues. Here's what we're worried about. Now let's work towards solutions. Because if we can define the issues, it makes this very emotional anxiety event of buying a house or selling a house a lot more manageable. And that's just what I use. So in law school, they teach you something called IRAC, which stands for, so it's IRAC, issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. So if you can point out the issue, and then we can look at the rule, which is maybe in the contract or Georgia statutes, and then we analyze that. So we kind of pull the issue with the rules. We think about our specific situation, and we come to a conclusion. That's a really, really great way of kind of getting that emotional side of it out of this, getting it, kind of put to the side, and we just deal with the issues. And it's a really great way if you want to use that for yourselves. So the first issue, timing. There's almost never enough time to plan repairs, depending on what the size and the scope. The seller doesn't want to have to do them because they're moving, and they're buying something else. Maybe they're moving to Florida, California. They might be sick, or maybe it's an estate. Someone's recently passed away. The timing, it's always a crunch, and getting a contractor in there, especially one that's affordable and will do a good job, man, it's just brutal, as you all know. And every selling agent wants the timing, the repairs to be completed like a week before closing or 10 days before closing. Obviously, that's the preference. But man, that's brutal. That's really tough to accomplish. So if we think about it, you're going to go under contract on December 1. The inspection is going to be 7 to 10 days. We'll negotiate with the seller, and the seller will agree, okay, we'll do the repairs and we'll have it done 10 days before closing. Okay, well, maybe it's a 30-day closing and we're in day 10 when we agree on this. So that means I've got maybe 10 days to pull this off before the buyer has to come in and do their walkthrough, 10 days before closing. And they want receipts. They want, it to be done right, all that. And so timing is really hard. And the reason you would maybe want those repairs done 10 days before closing or 7 days before closing is that, sorry, my phone's ringing, is that you want to see if it's done wrong. So, or right, I guess. So if it's done wrong, or if it's not done at all, you need that opportunity to have the seller go back and do it again before closing. You don't want to do it, do your walkthrough the morning of closing and realize, man, it's still not right. And then you're stuck with some really bad solutions. Your options are really limited if you didn't find out about this until day of closing on your final walkthrough. So timing is a major issue. The buyers might have small children and they cannot or refuse to do it themselves, or they discover the issues at walkthrough, which is what we talked about. I know on my personal house, we had some issues with the windows because the seals had broken. Windows take 3 to 4 weeks in normal circumstances. I think I had a buyer recently where the windows were an additional maybe 6 or 8 weeks out. And so there's no way you're getting that before closing. We have to figure out how to do that. So that's an issue, is timing. We've got 10, 15 days to get this work done. There might be stuff on back order. It may be hard to get the pricing right, and the seller ultimately is going to have to overpay, or the buyer is going to have to overpay to have this done prior to closing. And so timing is a big issue. Another issue, the repairs being done right. So the seller concerns that the seller doesn't want any liability if not done correctly. They want to be able to say, well, I hired X, you approved it, we're done here. I didn't do the work myself. And I think sellers have to be careful to do the work themselves, because there's a lot of extra liability if they do. What if you repaired the roof, it wasn't done correctly, and then there was a major accident? So maybe something fell through the roof, someone got hurt, something like that. Or any number of issues. Maybe the seller repaired the deck themselves, and then one of the deck boards split in half, and someone got seriously injured. So that's a major safety concern and liability for a seller who's out the door and maybe even left the state. Buyer concerns are that the sellers want it done cheaply, the buyer wants it done correctly. The buyer doesn't care what it costs. Obviously, it's a very unusual situation because the buyer's not paying for it. So I don't care I want it done right. Well, the seller's definition of right is going to be different than the buyer's. The seller's willing to make some compromises to make sure that the pricing is correct. So those are big concerns, that buyers and sellers are just on opposite ends of the spectrum. Issue number 3, having the cash to pay for it. This is a big issue. And I think it does depend on what price point we're at. So if we're talking about a $3 million house, typically the sellers can afford to have this work done prior to closing. I think that's probably a safe assumption, unless there's like unusual circumstances. Maybe it's a bankruptcy or a short sale or something of that nature. But generally, if you've got a $400,000 house or anything in that range, the seller might be a little strapped for cash. They can't afford to spend $12,000 on a foundation repair, or $25,000 on a foundation repair, or a $25,000 roof. Obviously, we've got some money issues that we have to contend with. In that scenario, the buyer wants it done before closing. The seller wants their money so that they can pay for it. What do we do? And then finally, this is the big issue, the really big issue, the lender. The lender is a major obstacle. And so we're going to talk about why and how, but generally, lenders do not want this to be mentioned, because if their underwriter finds out about it, then the underwriter is going to discount the purchase price. They're going to say, oh gosh, we're not closing unless that foundation is fixed. Well, a house appraised anyways, even with the issue. And so a lot of people, practically speaking, are like, I don't see the problem. Why does the lender care? And so we even go to the extreme and we don't tell the lender, which there are problems in that. I would rather you be open, transparent, forthright with everything. I think I'm not seeing as many issues where lenders put that up as a roadblock. Now, you may have a different experience, but generally we need to be able to explain everything to the lender and that it's being rectified. Then the lender can approve it and it's just on the up and up all the way through. I don't think there's any reason to not be transparent about what we're fixing and why. Unless there's some small circumstances, which we'll talk about. The other issue with a lender, by federal law, by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, I don't know if it's federal law, but Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac regulations, a seller cannot provide more closing cost credits than there actually are closing costs. That's a big issue if we didn't even realize that was a thing. So, you might say, well, the seller's going to contribute $20,000 and you're going to use that buyer. We're not going to say what we're using it for, but it's going to help the buyer go do the repairs themselves after closing. Well, you actually have to have $20,000 in closing costs. And generally, most people don't have that. You're looking at maybe 2 or 3% of the purchase price is your closing costs. So if you've got $1 million house, I suppose maybe then you would have a $30,000 closing cost, but that's probably even on the extreme side. I think you have to get estimates from your lender and from your closing attorney well before closing so that you know kind of what you can even expect, what your limits are. And we're going to talk about that because on this handout, I have a little table that talks about what your limits, in addition to actual closing costs. Our limits are also how much you're putting down and the type of loan you're getting. So those are our issues: timing, the repairs being done correctly, having the cash to pay for it, whether you're a buyer or a seller, and then the lender. Those lender issues throwing up things in the last second there. So let's talk about my preferences, and then maybe we can open it up and people can kind of talk about it in the chat feature as to what their preference is. But first, let's get the easy one out of the way. If you are paying cash, if your buyer is paying cash, the solution should always be a price reduction or a credit. And generally you would want a price reduction. That would be the idea, unless there's maybe some other scenario. Maybe the builder doesn't want a price reduction, or you're worried about commissions being reduced too much, or whatever it may be. But generally, price reduction is the simplest. I don't recommend a buyer have a high purchase price with a high credit on a cash deal. I think it's overly complex, because closing costs for what? I mean, the buyer's paying all of the fees anyways. They're paying the full purchase price and they're paying all the closing costs. They're paying any escrows. There wouldn't be escrows, but prepaids like insurance and things like that. A seller credit, just to me, doesn't really make sense. It's not really necessary. So if paying cash, just lower the price. The potential issue is that if you are hoping to reduce the purchase price through another contingency, you might be, some people would think that you're shooting yourself in the foot. So let me give you an example. You're going to buy $1 million house. You find on the inspection that there's a mold issue, but you also have an appraisal contingency. And so the mold issue is in the first 10 days. The appraisal contingency is on day 20. And you're like, well, I don't want to reduce the price because of the mold and then not be able to reduce the price when the appraisal comes in. I don't know. I don't like that argument. I don't like setting up my buyer to expect too much in that regard. I think let's dig into the appraisal thing first. The appraisal on a cash deal is not to validate that the house is worth it, in my opinion. It's really just to get another opinion. And unfortunately, it's a bad thing, in my opinion. So you're getting another person who's putting in their opinion as to whether this house is worth it. And now your buyer has a reason not to go forward with the deal because they're saying, well, so-and-so thinks, this appraiser thinks that it's not worth it. And that could totally kill a deal just by itself. If we look at a loan on an appraisal contingency, again, let's do $1 million deal and the buyer's putting 20% down. So the buyer is going to get a loan for 800,000. They're going to put in 200,000. Well, if it appraises for 900,000, the lender's loan is now going to go down because the lender is going to give you 80% of 900,000, not 80% of the million. So if we do 80% of 900,000, the lender's only going to give you 720,000. And so the buyer's going to have to come up with the rest, which is why there's a lot of leverage on an appraisal contingency when there's a loan. But that doesn't work for a cash deal. On a cash deal, the buyer was paying $1 million, and no matter what, if the price goes down or if the appraisal goes down, well, the buyer still has the $1 million. That hasn't gone away. Now, it's a little bit of leverage, but as a seller, I don't play that game. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense to me. So I would be, I don't think appraisal contingencies on cash deals mean all that much. I think it gives your buyer the ability to get out, but it doesn't really give them a whole lot of leverage other than the ability to terminate. As a seller, I'll call their bluff almost every time, unless there's a valid reason why the house needs to go down in value. So personally, I can see the scenario where you would not want to reduce the price. You would want just a credit for that mold issue, so that then 10 days later, when the appraisal comes in, if it comes down $20,000 lower, you say, well, hey, look, the appraisal says it's 980, and I know you gave me 20,000 credit, but I want another $20,000 off the purchase price because of the appraisal, or else I'm walking. I just don't see a seller biting there. I don't see that being really good leverage. So in my opinion, number one, appraisal contingencies on cash deals, I wouldn't recommend them generally, because it's really going to it's going to convince your buyer not to close, if anything, because the seller's not going to, it doesn't change the math for a buyer. And then, it does make it difficult, because in that scenario, you are basically telling your buyer, hey, look, what we should do is get this closing cost credit so that then later you can also get a price reduction. Well, what if they don't get the price reduction? What if that doesn't come through? What if it doesn't work out? Now the buyer thinks they're getting screwed. I just don't like that idea. I don't want unrealistic expectations for a buyer. And I think the, holding off on that is a problem. So generally, if it's a cash deal, just lower the price, because of the bigger issue, which is I don't want a seller doing the work anyways. I don't want a seller hiring the mold person and eradicating the mold or mitigating it or whatever it is. I'd rather my buyer hire the person that they want and just get the money to do it. Because if it's my wife and I want the power, I want the control. I want to be able to fire the contractor if they didn't do a good job, or if they're not truly contaminating or limiting the contamination. If they're not doing a great job, I want to be there every day. And as a buyer, I don't really have that responsibility and that authority to be there every day. But as an owner, I do. So I guess it's those two issues. I don't want to overcomplicate it. I just want to lower the purchase price, and then I want the buyer to take control. I don't want to rely on the seller doing a good job and hiring the right people and transferring over warranties. I'd rather not do that if I can help it. So that's my scenario on there. If you do lower the purchase price, some of the upsides on that are that your closing costs would go down. So if you're paying $980 versus $1 million, your taxes are going to go down. Your title insurance is going to go down. Commissions, yes, they go down. But it's not a ton. It's a slight amount, and I think it will also help with property taxes going forward. If going this route, you may want to negotiate a commission change. So if you just did a special SIP, commission shall be blank, and just put a hard number. So if it's commission shall be 30,000 and 30,000 on $1 million property, going to 980 would lower that, but you could still say commissions are going to be the 60,000 total. I've seen that. You may be uncomfortable doing that. You may choose not to, but it's an option. All right, so we got the cash deal out of the way. Just know for cash deals, you can do anything you want. You really can. You could do a credit. You could do a purchase price reduction. You could do an escrow holdback. You could have the seller doing repairs. You could do all that stuff. But honestly, just do a purchase price reduction or a credit and have the buyer do everything. That's going to be my preference. So now we have a loan. And we're going to talk about a loan maybe in a more normal circumstance, at least from what I experienced. Let's say it's a $500,000 house and they're going to get a $400,000 loan. So they're going to put 100 grand down. That'd be a 20% down payment. So what most people do in that situation is that the seller is going to do the repairs. So you've got this laundry list of things in that amendment to address repairs. And the seller is going to try and knock each one of them off, ground the GFCI and secure the deck to the back of the house, and maybe fix a French drain or something along those lines. And maybe in a lot of circumstances, it's hiring a handyman to go out for a day or two and fix all those things. But again, we talked about those issues, so let's run through them again. The timing of it. Having to get it all done at a right price by the right people, and then having the buyer review everything well in advance of closing. So let's go to my number one solution, which is have the seller give you a credit or just pay vendors at closing. So that's a new one that many of you may or may not have seen before. And there are some issues with it, but generally it works. So let's say there's mold. We already know the mold company we want to use, but they're backed up for a week or two. And that means they wouldn't be done until like the day before closing. And generally what I would recommend on a mold deal is that the work gets done. We wait a couple of days for it to settle, for all the things to settle, for maybe a couple of days of humidity to go through the house. And then the buyer has it tested again to make sure that everything's been eradicated. But if you're trying to get it in before closing, that's not realistic. That timing's not really available to you. So in an ideal world, we negotiate and settle on everything on like day 5 or 6. The seller goes and gets it fixed. We wait a couple days, maybe even a week, and then the buyer does a second mold test to verify that it's all done and dandy. It's all perfect. That's a perfect time frame, but maybe not very realistic. So Tanya asked, are we allowed to cut vendors again now? I've been told we can't do it. Carpet replace, windows, etc. Yeah, you can do it. Now, the trick is that number 4 issue, if you remember what number 4 is, the lender. Before offering these solutions to a buyer and seller, I would make sure to talk to the lender. Closing attorney is not going to have a problem with this. Campbell Brandon, my office does it all the time. I don't see an issue with it. We just have the seller pay Lowe's for the carpet install, and I give the buyer the check. That's typically what I'll do. Unless the work's already done, I'll give the buyer the check. And when the work is done, the buyer then pays it to the contractor directly. So that's the solution I love. And the reason why I say you have to talk to the lender is just go ask them, because every lender is different and every repair is different. If we're talking about a foundation issue, lender's not going to want to see a $25,000 check for a foundation issue paid by the seller, generally, because then it's an underwriting issue. They don't like that. We're not holding money in escrow. We're not having to verify on the settlement statement, but it gives them notice that they don't like. Tanya's been told not to do it anymore. And it must be your lenders. It just depends. It really depends on the type. And so I think they're giving you a blanket statement of don't do it. But if you ask the lender beforehand, say, hey, look, we've got $800 worth of deck repair stuff that the seller's going to pay at closing. Do you see an issue with that? And lender 1 may say, no, I don't see an issue. Let's do it. And awesome. Let's go for it. Then you reach out to your buyer, reach out to your sellers, offer it as a solution, see if that works. But I don't want you to offer it before verifying, because option number 2 is the lender says no. The lender says no, thank you. And Prosperity does say no on these sometimes, but sometimes they don't. I've done them with Prosperity, but I think they do like it where it's just perfect. The house is perfect, the underwriting's perfect, there are no conditions, but life is not perfect. That's just not very realistic. So what are the issues other than the lender? The other issue is that the work's not done before closing. And if we go back to that timing issue, a lot of buyers, that's not acceptable to them. So if we think about the hypothetical, the buyer's buying a $500,000 house, they're moving in on a Friday, they've got 3 kids in tow, and there's still mold issues. Obviously, that's not acceptable to your buyer. So before offering it to a seller, first we'd verify with the lender, and then we'd say, hey, look, here's one option. And the buyer just could say, no, not acceptable. The work has to be done prior to closing so that we can move in. Otherwise, we have to delay our sale or extend our lease. Those are obviously the issues that you'd have there. But the upside, buyer gets to manage it. It can, maybe they can even do less work and save some money on it. Whatever it may be, everyone kind of motivated to hit the same goal. And the work doesn't have to be done prior to closing. We don't have that huge time crunch. And I think that leads to the other issue of that time crunch, which is, man, is it not fun to be verifying that work was done correctly the night before closing. Every week I get a text from, one of the agents that says, oh my gosh, none of the work is done. Oh my gosh, half of the stuff wasn't completed. And it's really, really anxiety producing. It's brutal, as you know. So if we can avoid that crunch, even if the buyer isn't at first happy about it, even if the lender isn't at first happy about it, see if you can push it. Be like, look, buyer, I know you didn't want this, but I've seen way too many times, I've heard way too many stories where the work wasn't done. We walked through the property morning of closing or the night before, and it's the worst day of your life because you think you're getting screwed and you're supposed to enjoy your closing. And someone taught me this, and I think it makes sense to me. Your buyer and seller remember 2 things. They remember the most stressful portion of your closing or the highest emotional demand, whether it's positive or negative. And they also remember the last thing that you did with them. And you just don't want those 2 events to be on the same day. You don't want the highest stress, most impactful day, freak out moment to be the day that they're supposed to sign their closing documents. I think if we can avoid that, this is one way to, just get a check at closing and go do it yourself. And that could be paying a vendor, or that could be a closing cost credit. And we'll talk about that a little bit further in just a minute. So buyer repair items or seller repair items, that's the next one. So that's the third option, which is, the seller does the repairs prior to closing. The best advice I can give you in that is, buy yourself as much time ahead of time, or at least, get updates from the listing agent a week beforehand. Say, hey, can you give me an update as to the status of the 10 repairs? GSCI, is that done? Is the plumbing done? Is the, did the mold company come out yesterday, or were the trees removed yesterday, the dead trees, whatever it may be? Were those things done and completed? If not, when are they next scheduled? So that it's not a surprise to you and your buyer, or to you and your seller, or to you as the listing agent. It's not a surprise to you when you realize your client didn't do any of the work the day of closing. So that's really the best thing. So if the best option beyond that is if the buyer can afford to do the repairs themselves, they should. So between having a seller do the repairs and the buyer, I don't care about the timing. I don't care about the money side of it. I think if the buyer can afford to do it themselves, they should, because that limits your number of issues on your transaction. It really shrinks them down, because at that point, the buyer's not upset with the seller. The buyer is only upset with their contractor, and it's their contractor, and they're not calling you for that. Or maybe they're calling you for a referral, or, hey, your guy didn't do what they said they were going to do, and now you know not to give them that referral again. But if the buyer can do it, if they can afford it, and we're going to talk about that, they probably should. The seller, if the seller is going to do the repairs, just verify, give yourself time, and then this is the most important part, because there are going to be delays. Even if you got the seller to agree to do it a week before closing, if they still weren't done, you still have to deal with the same issue. Hey, they're not done. What do we do? And really, you just have to make sure that your clients are flexible, your buyers are flexible, so that we can extend closing, so that we don't have to have this time crunch where I've got a U-Haul in the parking lot. That's usually when the buyer has to compromise the most, is when everything's packed up, their kids are in the lobby, the dogs are on a leash, and it's just ugly. So seller doing repairs is really brutal. So if that should be your last option, seller doing repairs. The buyer doing repairs should be a better option than that. The paying the vendors at closing, that's a better option than that. And then lowering the price and all those, closing cost credits so the buyer can do it later, that's the better option than that. So that's kind of my preference there. So let's talk about kind of how you game this, what I would recommend. So we talked about these limitations on how much a buyer can get in closing costs. So this is conventional loan, and you can search this on Google. So these are conventional loans. Let's read this off. If this is a primary residence or a second home, which in most cases, that's what we're working with, if they're putting less than 10% down, the maximum a seller can contribute is 3% in closing costs. That's the maximum. If they're putting between 10 and 25%, it's 6% down. And if they're putting more than 25% down, the seller can contribute as much as 9%, assuming the buyer has that many closing costs. Now, Rachel says, I've had some success in providing the seller with approved vendors, so we know the work will be solid. I love that, sir. That's beautiful. In fact, here's a stip that you could use. You could say, seller shall, and I'm going to write this in the chat, seller shall repair wood rot in the basement bathroom to be completed, let's say 5 days prior to closing by contractor, seller to provide receipts. There's a stip. I mean, that's obviously very simple. Seller shall repair wood rot in the basement bathroom to be completed 5 days prior to closing by blank contractor. Let's say it's Bob, or let's say it's Estes contract, the HVAC company. And there's going to be a little negotiation, and that's when you're going to get the realization that, hey, look, we got a problem. The seller's cheaping out on me, and the buyer doesn't care about cost. Let's find a middle ground. I mentioned earlier my house that my wife and I bought. We had some of this, and the nicest thing, the greatest thing that came of it is that we as the buyer and the seller both found the same contractor. So it was beautiful. It was just perfect. I wrote the stip in the chat. You should see that, Tanya. Oh, you don't see it. Well, it's seller shall repair wood rot in the basement bathroom to be completed 5 days prior to closing by the contractor. Oh, you know what? All panelists and attendees. There it is. All right, now you should see it. Okay, so a couple of things that you'll notice on that special stip. I did not reference the inspection report. I think that's a crutch that we should try to avoid, unless you want to do a second sentence that said, the wood rot as notated on the inspection report dated X date, so on and so forth. I've seen a lot of mistakes be made when we rely too much on the inspection report. The inspection report, all it is a heads up. It doesn't tell us how to fix it, how much to fix it, how much it should cost, who should fix it, any of those things. It just says, hey, there's a problem potentially. That's all it says. So instead of referencing page 5, you just say, I want all the wood rot in the bathroom of the basement replaced by Handyman Services, Inc. And, per invoice, estimate attached as Exhibit A. You can even attach the estimate. So now we have a scope of work. So the scope of work is going to be replacing the wood rot, replacing the drywall, repainting, putting the floors back down. That's a lot different than just fixing the drywall rot or wood rot. So you can see the kind of the difference there. We want to be as specific as possible so that the week before closing, when we go to do our walkthrough and we're like, wow, this was not done. They replaced it. It's half finished. This is a mess. It's not cleaned up. It's not painted. The paint is wrong. I think if we can be more specific, the better, is to avoid any of that overreaction from a buyer or seller. So Holly asks, my preference on the order. So lower the purchase price, yes. Purchase price should be your number one option because it saves the buyer money. It saves the seller money. But when there is a loan, when you lower the purchase price, you're also lowering the loan amount. So you have to be careful. Can the buyer reasonably pay for those repairs? In my scenario, if I'm buying a $500,000 house and I'm putting $100,000 down, and a lot of times the buyer should have an extra $3,000 to do the repairs themselves. So we're going to lower the price from $500 to $497, and then I'll just pay the $3,000 myself. Just realize it's not dollar for dollar when you're lowering the purchase price. The buyer doesn't save $3,000 at closing. They're going to save $3,000 or possibly more over the life of the loan, but they're not going to save it at closing. A cash deal, you would. So a cash deal, the buyer's going to save that money right on the spot. A closing cost credit, the buyer's going to save that money right on the spot. And Tanya, yes. So the idea of attaching a scope of work from a handyman rather than the inspection report is much clearer. And that's what I would always recommend, because what you're going to do is you're going to have that inspection report, and then you're going to call the HVAC company to go out and give you an estimate. So the buyer knows what it's really going to cost, and the seller knows. And the seller should go do the same thing. The seller should go to Coolray and get an HVAC estimate as well. We pick which company it is, and buyer may not care. Seller's going to care about the money side of it. So if Coolray is going to save them $450 to the seller, then that's what we'll go with. We'll go with Coolray. We'll attach the estimate as Exhibit A, and we'll either get a check at closing, or in this scenario, it'll be performed prior to closing, and the buyer will inspect it or whatever it is, and there will be a warranty. I mean, if you're going with someone like Coolray or Estes, you're going to get that warranty. The work's going to be warranted for at least a year. You could even add on additional coverage from there. So move away from referencing the inspection report. The inspection report, all it is a reference. It's like, hey, did you know? It's giving you notice. Now we got to go and actually dig deeper, because the inspection report could be wrong. In fact, on my inspection report, it's like, hey, there's a small crack in the foundation. Well, I don't know if that's an issue or not. So I call the foundation company, and they give me a report. In fact, I think I have one of those right here. This is not mine, but this is an inspection report by a foundation company. So air advice for your home, and they kind of talk about health inspections and all that. Here's the report. This is a foundation report. This is the real deal. This is a lot different than the home inspection. And they did airborne tests, mold tests, basically. Let's see if I have a picture of, oh, there's some nasty pictures of a leak, I think. Yeah, it looks like a leak. And some insects. So that's fun. So that's really what a buyer should have with an estimate. And then we hand it to the seller and say, seller, I'm not making this up. This is a professional company. They are licensed, insured. I'd like them to do the work. And the seller calls like 10 other companies, tries to get a little lower price. We negotiate over a price or which company it is. And you say, seller shall have this repaired by X company per, the estimate as attached to Exhibit A or dated November 11th, what is today, the 9th, and to be performed prior to closing, at least 3 days prior to closing. So that's kind of what I would look at. That's how I would approach that as a buyer. I would approach that as a seller, because ultimately we're not trying to win here. We're trying to get a good deal for our client. We're trying to promote this closing from going into the tubes, into the dumps. So here's an example on the last thing I really want to hit. So the contract is $200,000 with a 95% loan. So that's $10,000 down, and $4,000 in closing costs for a total of $14,000 cash to close. So that's how much the buyer would have to pay in order to buy this house. They're going to pay their down payment plus the closing costs, $14,000. During the due diligence, the buyer discovers repairs totaling about $3,000, which the seller agrees to pay as seller's credit to closing costs. Because you took zero initially, buyer expected to pay the full closing costs and the down payment. And when we found repairs that needed to be done, we didn't ask the seller to do the repairs, we asked them for a check. And the buyer can do them or not after closing. Maybe they just use this as a negotiation. They really didn't want to do the repairs, saying, oh, I'm not worried about those repairs, I'm tearing the house down anyways. But the seller doesn't know that. We're just negotiating. Hey, you got $3,000 worth of issues here. I want to check. Best way to get it, closing cost credit in that scenario, because that's money into the buyer's pocket. So now what happens is you've got a $200,000 price, $190,000 loan, because we didn't change the purchase price, $1,000 in closing costs. So now the buyer is out of pocket $11,000, as opposed to the prior example where they were out of pocket $14,000. And they can use that extra $3,000 just to put in their pocket. They're tearing the house down anyways, or they can use it to go do the repairs. Maybe they can save a little bit of money. Maybe they can do it for $2,200, or if they do it themselves, maybe they'll do it for $1,900. And really that's the nice way to do it, as opposed to the other way, which I think most people do, where they're asking for the $3,000 up front. So their buyer is under the expectation that they're going to have $11,000 in closing costs right at the beginning. And then we go through the inspection, we find $3,000 worth of issues, and we can no longer ask the seller to give us $3,000 because we don't have $7,000 in closing costs. We only have $4,000. So if you think of that, the math there, we had $4,000 in closing costs and a $3,000 credit. We can't ask for another $3,000 in credit, because then you'd be at $6,000 in closing cost credit for only $4,000 in closing costs. So you got a gap. You got a $2,000 gap that you're not going to be able to use at closing, which goes back to the seller. That doesn't work. So, what we probably need to work on is keep your closing costs as close to zero as possible, so that we can then later on ask for closing costs during our inspection. I think generally, if you're dealing with a loan, that's how you're going to want to work it. And it's not really changing the math all that much for a buyer, but what it does do is it sets them up for an easier path to getting there. And so again, ask for as little on closing costs as you can, so that you have that wiggle room to ask for more later. And yes, this sheet, this is something you can pull on Google. You also have it on this handout on the second page. This is only for conventional loan. FHA and VA, I think they're similar, but the percentages are off a little bit. But be careful, because this percentage, you actually have to have those costs. You really do. So I think generally, let's take a step back. Timing issues, repairs being done correctly, having the cash to pay for it, whether you're a buyer or a seller, and then the lender. Those are the main things we have to negotiate, and every deal is going to be a little bit different. But if you can follow those guidelines, follow the priorities, you'll probably be better off. Ask your buyer how much they have in excess cash. Could you do the repairs yourself if we can't have the seller do them? And tell them, hey, my preference is to not ask the seller to do the repairs, but instead just ask for money. And that way we don't have this crazy walkthrough issue. You can see the difference of a walkthrough where you're verifying repairs are done versus a walkthrough you're just making sure the house didn't fall apart since the last time you saw it. The repairs still need to be done in that second scenario. It's just you're going to do them after closing. So you're going to have a lot less anxiety in a buyer. You personally are going to have a lot less anxiety. The seller can move on and not have to worry about checking in on contractors. We don't have to worry about saving a dime here or a dime there. The buyer can do that later. And it's not going to be a part of your transaction. It's just money. And the money is done at closing. It's all done. If you didn't see the table on your handout, we'll have to update that. But I thought it was on there, so I apologize. But again, just do a Google search and say closing costs limit on conventional loan, or seller closing cost credit on FHA loan. And that's just where I pulled it. I pulled it right from that. And it's on Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac's website. So I think ultimately, talk to your lender if there is one, and make sure that whatever solution you do offer is going to be acceptable by the lender. Because I don't want you to take my advice and run with it only to have the lender say no later. There are a lot of lenders that do allow you to pay vendors at closing, but there's some that won't, and it does depend on the type of work being done and the type of loan that they're getting. So Rachel, you asked another question. So with a buyer that needs closing costs to close initially, the only option is really the seller doing the repairs beforehand. What is the best option that seller is short on cash? The pay at close option is not always doable if the vendor won't allow it. Credit card is probably the best solution there, Rachel. So she's talking about a really tough situation where the buyer doesn't have the money. You know, they're asking for the seller to contribute most of the closing costs so they can have as little money in the deal as possible. And the seller doesn't really have the money until they close, but the vendor won't accept payment afterwards. You know, you really have those two options. The seller has to use credit card, or the seller just has to, hey, look, I can't pay you until closing. And if that contractor doesn't allow it, then you got to find a different contractor. And then ultimately you can always talk to the lender about, hey, can we pay these things at closing? Is that going to be a problem? Work's going to be done. So Neil asks, I thought we were not meant to mention inspection report, as this could be an issue with mortgage companies who can then request the inspection report and insist on other things are done before close. I've never seen a lender request the inspection report, but I suppose it's possible. But ultimately, Neil, we're not hiding things from the lender. We're not trying to do that. We're not actively doing things that, you know, so the lender doesn't know. We're not going to name the amendment, you know, Amendment A, and then the next one's going to be Amendment 1. We're not going to play that game. We're going to be transparent. We're going to ask for closing costs. We're going to ask for things to get repaired, and we're not going to worry about that. And honestly, if your lender can't overcome those issues, we need to know about that sooner rather than it being a surprise to us at closing, because you have to assume the lender is going to find out. You have to. Now, if the lender says, hey, look, I'm not worried about that, just don't send it to me, that's fine. But you've got to be in the process of sending it to them already. So I know that may sound different than what you're being taught, but transparency really is the best policy in this scenario. If there is an issue with the deck that needs to be addressed, we're going to address it. And ultimately, if you decide on a credit by the seller, great. Just say the seller credit shall be blank. You don't have to go above that and say that the seller credit shall be blank in lieu of repairing the deck, which is falling off the side of the mountain. You don't have to go that far, right? So let me put the stip here. Seller, let's see, the seller credit to closing costs shall be blank. That's the step. You don't have to say, you know, in lieu of repairs. You don't have to say that. You don't have to say that at all. That's probably where you can get yourself in a little bit of trouble, because now you got to answer a question about repairs. But if you're just getting credit, do that. But alternatively, it's going to be seller shall repair the deck, support, and or let's say prior, 7 days prior to closing, per the estimate and scope of work as attached in Exhibit A. That's great. There's not a lender in the world that can deny your loan because the seller is going to do some repairs to the house prior to closing. Now, if the seller is going to do it after closing, so floors shall be replaced. Or let's think a different scenario. It's hard for me to do the special steps while we're talking about the class. But if we're going to do a floor replacement because there's some issue with the floors, maybe they're not level, or maybe they're dangerous, who knows? And the seller is not going to be able to do it before closing, so they're going to just pay a vendor and it'll get done afterwards. It's just going to be seller shall pay blank. So let's say it's lumber liquidators. Seller shall pay lumber liquidators $3,700 to repair the floors at closing. So as a closing attorney, I know I got to write a $3,700 check to Lumber Liquidators. The lender knows that there's a check being paid at closing. The work's going to get done afterwards. And maybe the lender has an opinion to us and says, hey, look, I don't like this. If it was only 700, I'd say let's do it. But at 3,700, we really need to do an escrow agreement. We'll do a second appraisal. But we're going to do that on day like 9. We're going to call the lender on day 9 and verify that we're following their process. We're not going to just do this without asking the lender. We're not going to offer it as a solution to our seller without the buyer first asking their lender. We're going to say, hey, I know all the options that are on the table. It's reduce the purchase price, do a credit to closing costs, pay the vendor at closing, the seller do it ahead of time, the buyer do it afterwards, right? Those are like 5 or 6 solutions. I'm going to put them all out on the table. Buyer, you call your lender. Seller's willing to do any one of them, but we would prefer just paying you. Will your lender allow it? That's the solution. So you never do anything without talking to the lender first. You can think of the solutions, but I don't want you putting anything in paper, like no amendments or any of that, just to have to change it later. Call the lender first. Call the attorney for the creativity side of it. Call your broker to, for recommendations. I saw last week we did it this way. Why don't you ask the lender if they'll do that? But ultimately ask the lender, then verify with your buyer and seller to make sure that they'll do that they're okay with it, and then go do it. But if you can, avoid doing the repairs prior to closing, because that is very stressful and usually leads to a delay in the closing, or at least some very upset buyers and sellers, especially if they're new home buyers. They don't realize that that's a potential problem. So thank you for coming to this class. We're going to do these more. I hope this was helpful. We're on YouTube, so feel free to go on that and double check for all the other videos and for future videos. You'll be invited to future videos. Feel free to email me directly if you have questions about this or want any help with the special steps. Feel free to email me at cross@cb.law, and my name is Christian Ross. So if you're on YouTube, it's Christian Ross, and then Down and Dirty. Forgive the name. We used to call it Lunch and Learn, but I can't provide lunch when we're doing it remotely. So hope this was helpful. But ultimately, talk to your lender, talk to your clients, get it done, and try to keep the anxiety as low as possible. Good luck, everybody. And